Linux is great for choice. That's something that is really valuable about Linux. There are a lot of people who are saying there's a lot of fragmentation. Personally, I don't believe that. I think that the core technologies that are common amongst all of the Linux distributions, like the kernel, desktop environment, that gets developed relatively independently from the distributions, but with contributions from those downstream projects. But what ends up happening is the collection of ideas that people have across all the distributions ends up making Linux much more innovative than one single project, like say Windows or Mac, that are trying to target everyone. And those ideas often make, distributions that are very distant in its goals from each other help each other because of those new ideas.
Well, welcome back everyone. If you're joining us, thanks for tuning in. We're actually going to be having a really good chat today with one of the co-founders of the Zorin OS project, which Zorin OS 15 came out a couple months back now. And you can go check out the review. There's plenty of them around YouTube, and you can have a look at mine as well. I'll chuck it up in the cards. But I'm having a chat with Artyom Zorin, who is graciously given us his time today just to talk about Zorin OS as a project and where it's come from, what it's experiencing now, and some of the, we'll talk a little bit about the desktop Linux landscape. As I think Zorin OS is a mover and shaker in convincing people that desktop Linux is a viable alternative, it's a viable solution. And then also, towards the end of the conversation, we'll talk a little bit about future stuff with what's coming up in the Zorin project or maybe what some hopes and ambitions are. So first of all, big welcome to you, Artyom. Thanks for coming on the show, as it were. And look, I've been excited for this conversation for some time. Just before we started recording, I mentioned to Artyom that back in 2011 was when I first came across the Zorin OS project, and it was back in its relatively early days. And I really enjoyed probably the vision of what you guys had for desktop Linux as a very viable alternative for people to switch from Windows and from Mac OS. And it's been so much fun to watch this project grow and change and become more ambitious as time has gone on. And honestly, what you guys have created with Zorin OS 15 is really special. And I think a lot of outlets, a lot of press have really enjoyed what you guys have put out. So it must feel pretty special, I guess, from your guys' perspective, seeing this thing grow. But before we get sort of too far into it, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly, maybe a couple of things that you like doing apart from working on Zorin OS, and then we'll kick into where Zorin OS started. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm Artyom. I'm one of the founders of the Zorin OS project. Started way back in 2008, actually, back in school. Apart from Zorin OS, I like, meeting with my friends and going on, hikes and walks, listening to music and whatnot, and just generally things like that. So thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no problem at all. So so Zorin OS is a project that where did it start? Where was the first thought of a custom Linux distribution? You guys were thinking about it. What was the impetus? What was the main starting motivation for you guys to start this project?
Yeah, so back in the summer of 2008, that was when my brother Kirill and I, we first started using Linux. We actually just came across it based on a bunch of customization videos. Compiz back in the days was something we thought really cool. So we decided to give Ubuntu a shot, and from the very beginning, we really loved it. We thought it was incredible. Not only the customization side of things, but just it made the computer run so much faster. It was way more secure. We just thought that it was better than Windows and Mac in pretty much every way. So we were really excited about it, and we showed Ubuntu to our dad, and he thought it was interesting, but that was when we discovered really what we thought was the main issue with desktop Linux, especially back in those days, was just the fact that it wasn't user-friendly at all. It was very unfamiliar. So if you're just a regular computer user, it would feel very startling, moving from something more traditional like Windows over to, a Linux-based desktop. And we thought to ourselves, this is probably the biggest hurdle that is stopping Linux from becoming really popular and getting everyone to take advantage of all of its features and what's great about it. And we thought to ourselves, hey, there's this National Science Fair that's coming up that happens every year. Why not do some project about it? Why not even try to see if we can fix that problem? And so that's really where the idea of Zorin OS first came to be.
Moving on, so when was the first Zorin OS project? Like, when did that officially become a thing on the internet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we publicized the fact that we're making the operating system pretty early on, so in September of 2008. But the first release was actually around 9 months later. That's when we got version 1.0 out on, if I remember correctly, the 1st of July 2009. And so that's really when things really started, and when people started using what we created. So since then, we've been really grateful for all the feedback and all the users that we got very early on. That's what really helped us to, guide the project to where it is today, but also just generally their support was really encouraging early on. So that's when we really decided there's really something there. We should go ahead and continue on this.
Yeah. And I don't know whether the goals that you had for Zorin OS back then are any different to what they are now, but in your minds back then, what were the initial goals that, what were you wanting to create that was different? Or what was the niche that you saw, that you wanted to fill compared to, Ubuntu and Mint and some of the other ones that were out there at the time?
So it really started off with that central goal of what's there stopping Linux from becoming, really popular with the general public, and how can we fix that? And making a system that was really specifically designed to be really user-friendly for that use case of someone switching over from Windows and Mac over to Linux. That was the direction that we always took when we were making our new decisions about where to take the operating system. We really loved using all the other Linux distributions out there. Each one has its own kind of personality, what it's great at doing. And we thought that rather than trying to make, just a regular Linux distro without any goals would be not as useful, as well as not as rewarding as creating something with the specific goal, especially the one that we had. That was something that really got us excited, not just for the technical parts of building an operating system, but also for seeing if there is something that we can do to make a difference in the Linux community.
Absolutely. The one of the fascinating things I think about the distribution when it first launched, when I first came across it, was that I definitely appreciated all of those tweaks that were being made. I was still, like, in regards to making it accessible for new Linux users, because even though I was starting to make videos on Linux in late 2010, I still had very little idea. I was like discovering all this new stuff. And so I was making videos as I went and as I learned stuff and as I found stuff out. And one of the fascinating things was that from my point of view, I really enjoyed what your project was bringing to the table, because I was, one of the, I guess, demographic that you were after, somebody who was wanting to switch over to Linux and make it their full-time thing. And, or make it their primary operating system. But what I noticed was that, while there were plenty of people that really did appreciate what you were doing, there was also plenty of people that looked at it like any other Linux distribution for a Linux nerd and going, oh, well, I don't like this and I don't like this and they're too much like this. And you're probably more than familiar with all of the comments from the Linux diehards. And to me, that was always an interesting split. And looking even in my own comment section of like, I think I did a Windows 7 versus Zorin video project back in the day. And seeing the comments split there with like people really loving the project because of how accessible it was, and then others not really getting it or not really appreciating it and just kind of going, why does this thing exist? And this distribution does this better and this distribution does this other thing better. And so I guess my question to you is, clearly your vision for the project is what carried it through all its iterations. But did you have any other thoughts, or did you take on any of the other feedback that you were getting from diehard Linux users who would come across it and maybe be a little bit dismissive about it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the thing that was really most important to us when we got the first version out was looking really closely at the feedback of everyone who's using it. And we're, of course, grateful for all the feedback that we got. But it was interesting to see how, different kinds of users had different kinds of feedback. So the users that we were originally targeting, and we still are mainly targeting, are the new users. And what we got from them was really insightful to help us build the project. But also the Linux users that were previously using other distros like Ubuntu, Mint, Fedora, their feedback was also really valuable as well, because we didn't want to make a system that's purely just for new users. We wanted to make something that would be approachable for everyone and still remain with all of the power and features that Linux had. And in fact, we did get a lot of original Linux users from other distros that felt much better about using Zorin OS rather than, the distros that they were using before. Not just because that it was designed for, Windows users and making the switch over easier, but the other qualitative aspects of it. So like even the design of the system, how we approach making the theming as well as the application selection. So we didn't want to take one user group's feedback into account and just throw away everyone else's. We thought there was a lot of value in what other people were saying. There were, of course, a lot of people who didn't quite understand the goals behind Zorin OS. They viewed it as something like they compared it to other more technical distributions like Arch and Gentoo. And that is understandable. That still happens today. And what we think is that Linux is great for choice. That's something that is really valuable about Linux. There are a lot of people who are saying there's a lot of fragmentation. Personally, I don't believe that. I think that the core technologies that are common amongst all of the Linux distributions, like the kernel, desktop environment, that gets developed relatively independently from the distributions, but with contributions from those downstream projects. But what ends up happening is the collection of ideas that people have across all the distributions ends up making Linux much more innovative than one single project, like, say, Windows or Mac, that are trying to target everyone. And those ideas often make, distributions that are very distant in its goals from each other help each other because of those new ideas. So yeah, there are a lot of comments and feedback that we get from users that don't quite understand what Zorin OS is about. Maybe they already use a Linux distribution that is more technical and they're happier with that. But there is an awful lot of useful feedback that they give. So we're really grateful for the diversity of feedback that we get.
Yeah. Okay. So we're thinking about your initial vision and goals for the project, and seeing, your first iteration or first version of that land. We talked about you getting some of the feedback from the community and how that's kind of continued to shape Zorin in a lot of ways. The next question I have for you is, was there a moment, either right at the beginning of the project or somewhere between then and now where you really hit upon that aha moment that, oh wow, we might actually be onto something big here. This is totally worth us doing?
Yeah, so since we released the first version of Zorin OS back in 2009, we received a lot of feedback from all sorts of different kind of users, and most of it was very positive. But the one piece of feedback that I think was really motivating that we got early on was someone was saying that, hey, I had my grandma's computer was running really slow and it was on Windows 7, I think it was back then. And I went in and fixed it by installing Zorin OS. And the next day she went to use her computer. She didn't even notice that there was nothing new on the system, except that it was running faster. And I think that was really, it epitomizes everything that we were striving for in Zorin OS by making a system that's so user-friendly and familiar that you don't have to learn anything new, but you could still take advantage of all the great features and advantages that Linux has. And that really motivated us and so made us see that what we're doing is something really worthwhile.
Yeah, that's excellent. I can remember, again, casting my mind back to my own first experiences with Zorin. Some of the things that I really appreciated about it were the fact that a lot of the tweaks that I would have to go digging for to try and make happen in different distributions were already there. Back then, even having things like codecs was was a bit of an issue, but things like drivers, things like having Wine pre-installed, things like having Play on Linux up and running, things like the different desktop layouts that you could switch to with like a click of a button. All of these things were, and you could probably correct me here, but all of these things were, I'm pretty sure, were present around that 2011 time when I first discovered Zorin. So you would have been a few versions in at that point. But all of those things were tweaks that I would make, but it would always change on which distribution I was making. And so I just loved the fact that it was already there and it was ready to go. So I just want to loop back around to something that you said just a second ago, where you were saying that you got a really gold piece of feedback from a person who installed it on their grandmother's computer and she couldn't tell the difference. There's I think a counter argument in the Linux world around this idea of what is user friendliness, and is it something that is intuitive? What is intuitive design? And I'm going round in circles here a little bit, but trust me, I'll get there. Or do we stick with familiar user paradigms with the risk that fundamentally these operating systems are different? And so there will be times where they'll have to learn something new. And so do we try and ease the pain by making it very familiar to them, and maybe they won't be able to tell the difference? Or do we give them something very simple and new to make them sure of the fact that they're using something different and might have to learn new things while they're kind of learning the whole operating system? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, actually. I actually think it's a blend of the two. So if you take a look at other similar projects, other operating systems, for example, out there that are in the general public, there are elements between them that are very similar and familiar, and that is for a reason. So if someone wants to start using the new product, they want to actually be able to use it. So first impressions really are everything. If there's a new user who's on the fence about maybe switching over to some new system or a new product, chances are if they encounter some major usability issues, something that stops them from smoothly using a product, they're probably not going to be too enthusiastic about continuing on. They might see that as, a fence that they cannot cross. And that is something that we paid really close attention to when we were designing Zorin OS. So we see that a certain qualities and certain aspects of it that are familiar with other systems is something that's really important to have in any new kind of product. And that, of course, isn't something that should be an absolute. You shouldn't completely copy something and expect people to use it in exactly the same way as what they were using before. That kind of makes things a bit less fun. There's not much room for innovation. And alluding to certain aspects of it that are different is something that we also find very important to highlight. So we don't make the system look and feel exactly like Windows. It's not styled like Windows. The start menu doesn't work exactly like in Windows. From our research and from our feedback, we've found that people prefer a categorized menu as a specific example rather than all programs. Just something very specific there. But we have gotten some feedback saying, hey, why don't you make the system look exactly like Windows 7? Make the theme exactly like theirs. And that's something that's a line that we don't want to cross, simply because it gets to that point where people expect it to look and run exactly like Windows. So to kind of sum up this point, a blend of those two is really the sweet spot that we're trying to hit. And for any new kind of project that wants to get a critical mass of users, striking that balance is something that is very important, at least in our opinion, to find early on when designing the product.
Yeah, excellent. I think you've covered that question really well. It's a complicated one, and I've seen the points go back and forth on either side. So appreciate you weighing into that one. So if we're sort of looking at more in the present day, Zorin OS 15 was a big release for a lot of great reasons. I'm sort of curious, just in terms of metrics, I guess, between when you launched and now. Was there a particular release that you felt, gained more of a critical mass in terms of, amount of downloads, amount of visits to your website, that kind of thing? Because from my perspective, when Zorin OS 15 came out about it, I was hearing about it from a lot of different places. I would imagine you have like some idea of the different releases that have happened up to this point and which ones have performed well, or, yeah. Can you weigh into that at all?
Yeah, we were especially really flattered by the feedback from Zorin OS 15. That is by far the biggest new launch that we've had, and we were really excited to see that it goes up every new release. I think there were a few releases of Zorin OS which did make a very big difference in how we were going to continue the project. So early on, there was Zorin OS 3. Most people wouldn't have used it by now, but that was the first release with the look changer, which eventually became the layout switcher in Zorin Appearance. That was a release that was very widely covered, specifically because of that feature, which ended up being really important later on down the line. Zorin OS 12, which was our previous release before that, was also another one that was pretty widely covered. That was when we made the switch over to the GNOME Shell desktop environment, and a lot of work had to be done to get that release out. We pretty much had to throw all of the code that we had previously away and start from scratch, which was a really good and refreshing experience to really boil down what is important in Zorin OS and really nail those specific features and aspects. And then another release was Zorin OS 8. That was especially important because that was around the same time when Windows XP was losing support. So we got a lot of interest in that release. And interestingly enough, in January next year, Windows 7 is going to lose support as well. And we expect a lot of people to be interested in Zorin OS and Linux in general at that point in time. But yeah, so far, Zorin OS 15 was the biggest release, and we've been really flattered by the feedback.
Yeah, that's excellent. So do you feel like, looking back over the different releases that have happened, what do you I don't know, the critical and the critical response that's been very positive, honestly, for Zorin OS 15. Are there any particular points that you feel you could owe the success of Zorin OS 15 to at this particular cycle? What do you think the things that are the consistent points of feedback that are coming through? It's always interesting to hear from one of the developers of the project what comes through to you as you kind of process all of the different opinions from around the internet.
Yeah, so I mean, the new release had a bunch of new features like Zorin Connect to, merge the experience between your computer and phone. The new desktop theme, and as well as that, the auto theme feature, which changes from light to dark over the day. That was also another feature which people really liked. Or a bunch of other features, yeah. But I think the most important part of the release was actually just the fit and finish that was put into it. The real attention to detail that we put in. Like, originally we wanted to get Zorin OS 15 out back in November of last year, but things just took longer than expected because we really wanted to nail this release and make it as great as we possibly can. And judging by the feedback, I think that was a good decision to take that extra time out to make it really stable, really fast, and just get rid of the rough edges and make it really ready for the general public.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Hey, so when you're looking at, we've kind of discussed this question a fair bit. I've kind of got two questions around Zorin OS as it currently stands and what it's currently trying to do. So, first of all, do you see a particular demographic that you think can benefit a lot from Linux desktop use, especially like Zorin OS, obviously? So is there a particular demographic? And then secondly, and this is probably a much larger question, talking about just the Linux desktop ecosystem as a whole, that I'll come back around to after we've addressed that first question. But just around the business model of Zorin OS, because obviously, developers have to eat. And the model that you guys have landed on is having a core version available for everyone, having a light version that's available for everyone, having business and ultimate editions that are that have a certain monetary value attached to them, and also support backed into those as well. So the reason that I'm linking those two questions together is because, at least from where I sit, your business model makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about the demographic that you're wanting to get on board. So if you want to address the demographic, like, who do you think has the most to gain by thinking about the Linux on the desktop, and who do you think those people are, or who would you love to see using Zorin, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, in the long run, it's we'd want to see as many people as possible in all kinds of user groups using Zorin OS. But at this specific point in time where we are right now, I think Linux has got to a point in its maturity that it's actually ready to go into the workplace. So businesses, governments, organizations of all types, especially right now this year, more and more of the software that businesses and organizations are using is moving towards the cloud. So it doesn't care about what platform it's on. Previously, the biggest problem with switching over to Linux was the app gap. Everything runs on Windows or Mac, and there's no equivalent app for Linux. That is starting to, that problem's starting to fade away because of the move to cloud, but also more and more companies are making apps cross-platform, including for Linux. And all the other advantages that Linux has, like the fact that it's so much faster that you can actually repurpose old computers and keep them running for longer. And also security, the fact that it's resistant to viruses. That is, all of those come together, all those advantages come together and make it really compelling for organizations of all types. Like, even back in 2016, there was a city in Italy, Vicenza, and they decided to make the switch over from Windows to Zorin OS. We actually only found out they were going to make the switch a couple of weeks beforehand. It was pretty informal. But we were following the process and helping them do that. And it was actually, even in my own experience, like, it was much more of a smooth transition than even I thought it would be. And that kind of blew me back and made me think, hey, this government has switched over relatively easily and taken advantage of all of what's great in Linux and Zorin OS. Why don't we make this available to all sorts of organizations? And we did learn an awful lot from what Vicenza, what experiences they had switching over. We took it very closely, all of the positive and negative feedback. And we saw that the operating system in most use cases is actually pretty much more mature than even needs to be to accomplish all the kinds of functions that, you know, an organization might need to do on the computers. And we are actually starting to focus really in on getting those organizations over. And we're actually building a new product, which I can expand upon, to make that possible and make it easy for organizations to, you know, deploy Zorin OS and manage all the computers centrally.
Yeah, that is some really, really interesting developments just in terms of the widespread effects that deploying Linux in organizations and I'm especially thinking of organizations that can't afford the rigorous hardware upgrade cycle and have a bunch of older computers lying around. I've been a part of organizations that would benefit from something like that. So I guess, again, we don't have to spend long on this particular question either, but again, a common point of misunderstanding, I think, in the desktop Linux world and those who have used desktop Linux for a long time is that business model. It makes a lot of sense in my own head, and which is why I don't think I've ever sort of put it out there of, oh, why do you have to pay for this to get this thing? And I'm pretty sure from the vibe that I'm picking up around the place, I think there is more understanding of that business model now than possibly what there was a few years back in terms of having an Ultimate Edition that's pre-tweaked and preloaded and all that kind of thing. But what I'm hearing, and you can jump into this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that model for you, I'm guessing, has led you to make some decisions around how much time and how much of your own energy that you are investing in this project to make it work for wider adoption. Is that close, or am I way off here?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I could probably say that if it wasn't for the Ultimate Edition and all the people that contributed to the project, Zorin OS wouldn't be anywhere near to where it is today. It might not even exist anymore. And it is quite sad to see other projects that become discontinued. Like more recently, Antergos was another Linux distro that stopped simply because, you know, the original founder decided that they didn't have enough time to dedicate to the project, and they were busy with other things in their lives. In our case, we've been really blessed by all the users, and we really want to thank everyone who's used Zorin OS, and especially those who contributed to the Ultimate Edition. We are now actually working full time on Zorin OS, my brother and I, and we're also looking to hire more people later this year, full time, to work on Zorin OS and the projects related around it. So it has made a gigantic difference to have the Ultimate Edition and to have people contributing. And that is something that, it's a topic that has become a bit less taboo in recent years, but it's still something that there are misconceptions and some parts of it that people don't understand about Linux in general. It is important to be able to sustainably fund Linux-related projects. In many cases, a lot of contributors actually get funding simply because they work in a big company that funds the project, like Intel or Red Hat. They're gigantic donors to Linux-related projects, and they've been a really big influence on Linux, and it's been really great to have them. But for more independent projects, that has been something that funding has not seeped through enough. And a lot of Linux community-led projects don't get the funding that they do require to continue on. And it purely depends on the free time of the original maintainers to actually continue the project, which is becoming a bit more fickle now. There have been, especially in the past year, a lot of articles that have been released from open source maintainers that they're being stretched thin and they're not able to continue developing their projects at the rate that they would want to, simply because they're doing that in their free time for free. Having a stable and sustainable base to fund projects helps make the project more sustainable and developing faster, and just generally makes the quality of the code much better, and that benefits everyone, I think. So it is a case where Linux should be available for everyone. So if someone isn't able to contribute, I personally believe they should be able to continue using open source projects, and making it available for everyone, I think, is really important. But it is a good idea for open source projects to find a way to monetize themselves in order to maintain sustainable. So that is something that I think the Linux community ought to talk more about, and with a more cool-headed approach, because there are some flame wars that erupt over funding that we've seen across open source projects. It is a topic that I think needs to be discussed more and becomes less taboo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as somebody who has benefited an awful lot from the development that open source enthusiasts have made across desktop Linux and a lot of free and open source applications, at the end of the day, quality code, wherever it comes from, is going to cost time, and time costs money. It's going to either cost them in projects that they could be otherwise being paid to work on, or they could be just literally getting paid money to create these projects for everybody to freely use. I think I am all for creative approaches and different approaches to monetization to try and fuel development and keep it going for the long term. And you just take a look around at the ecosystem at the moment with what different projects are doing and the approaches that they're taking to monetization, whether it's, Patreon, or whether it's pay what you want to, or, having just a regular old donation system. Every big name project out there either has a ginormous backing behind it from other companies, or if it's close to the top, it has a passionate community behind it which are happy to fund it. And so whenever the question of, should we really be paying for something like an Ultimate Edition for Zorin, I always saw it as like if you want to contribute to the project, if you want to help make it stick around, if you want to see it continue to develop, then see it as a donation kind of thing, and just enjoy the extra the extra bit of work and fit and finish that they've put into that. So yeah, it's a absolutely, you're right. It's a good conversation that needs to keep happening, and I am keen, for any opportunity where a developer can figure out how to put food on the table but still make their work available to everyone. I think it's an exciting opportunity that is very unique to the Linux and free and open source software world. So speaking about different business opportunities, you've made a partnership with Star Labs. So they're a hardware computer manufacturer. Do you just want to give us like the brief kind of 2-3 minute story about how that came about?
Yeah, so, even since the very beginning of the project, we saw that one of the main hurdles that would be stopping Linux from getting into the hands of the public, beyond just the technical aspects of it, is actually making it easily available to use. So right now, the way most people get a Linux distro on their computer is by, downloading it, flashing it to USB or DVD, and installing it manually themselves, which isn't the most user-friendly approach for everyone. We saw that in order to get to a point where Linux is, generally used and accepted by the public, it needs to be something that is available right when the computer comes. So pre-installed on the computers. And partnering with these manufacturers is something that early on was a bit more difficult, because generally larger they tend to work in herds. So they will only sell products that they know will sell. And to them, they want to be conservative. They just want to preload Windows. And that's kind of been the chicken and egg problem that's gotten Linux, to where it is, but not much further. Because, on the one hand, they want to get more, we want more people to use Linux, but how do we get them to use Linux? Downloading isn't the most user-friendly way. Having it preloaded is more user-friendly, but the manufacturers want to see that enough people be using Linux for them to actually sell it. So it was a bit of catch-22. But as Linux has gotten more popular, there have been a lot of manufacturers, more niche and boutique ones like Star Labs, like System 76, that have catered to that Linux crowd and have really shown the public that, Linux is something that is ready for the public, and there is an increasing interest in computers running Linux. And Star Labs originally reached out to us saying that they were interested in putting Zorin OS on their computers, and we were really excited about that because we've heard a lot about Star Labs and how great the computers were, and we thought that it was a really great fit for the operating system that we had. Their computers were really polished and high quality, and we like to think the same about our of Zorin OS. So it was kind of a natural fit, and we decided to take it further this year with the launch of Zorin OS 15, just to show the first steps of Zorin OS being available on pre-installed computers. And also it helps the project because every time someone visits the Star Labs website to buy a computer, we get a small commission from it. And I think that is a business model that other Linux distributions can benefit from as well, to partner with those manufacturers and get interest that way as well. So I think that going on into the future, this is a really great first step. I think Star Labs are a really great computer manufacturers. The computers are stellar, no pun intended. And having that as the first step towards, getting even more manufacturers on board is something, it's an important thing to start early to get Linux to a stage where it is available for the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So, there's a lot of exciting history that's just been packed into the what is it now? 10 years? No, more than 10 years. 12 years. 12 years? Is that right? 12 years of this project. Look, if I can, we're almost clocking in close to an hour here, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and you've kind of teased it a little bit. What are your thoughts about the future of Zorin, and what are some of the things that that you guys are working on right now?
Yeah, so we've been working on Zorin OS for a while. It's been 10 years since the first release was made, and this is the first time where we can really confidently say that, I think Linux and Zorin OS are really ready from a technical level for the general public. So we're really moving on to our next step in our project's history. And as I said before, we think that organizations and businesses using Zorin OS is really our big next step. And what we're developing right now is a new management tool where organizations can install Zorin OS on their computers and manage all of the computers. So install apps, software updates, run scripts, basically have complete access over all of the computers just from a central console in the web browser. that is something that I see as really the missing piece in the puzzle that would make it very easy for lots of organizations to make the switch to Zorin OS and Linux in general. And we do want to make this new tool available for not just Zorin OS, but other Linux distributions as well. And we are really focused on developing that right now, and we want to get it out before the end of this year. That's in order to coincide with the loss of Windows 7 support. So we're going to see an awful lot of organizations thinking about how to approach moving away from Windows 7. And we think an awful lot of them are going to be interested in switching to something new like Zorin OS, like a Linux distribution, like Ubuntu or ourselves. And we want to make that option a really easy and obvious choice to make versus having to buy a whole load of new computers just to run Windows 10. And still having all of the drawbacks of Windows, like, the privacy issues where they're spying on your every key press and viruses and slowdowns over time. We want to make, with this tool, Linux the obvious choice for organizations of all different types. And we want to get that out before the end of this year so that, even more people start moving over to Linux. And the proceeds that we'll get from that new tool, which we'll be charging per computer per month, we want to reinvest that into making the Linux desktop even better for everyone. So contributing to open source projects upstream as well as downstream in our operating system, just to make the Linux desktop even better than it is right now and even more user friendly. So I think that direction would really benefit not just organizations, but pretty much everyone who uses Linux and will use Linux in the years to come.
Wow, that's exciting. I think, like you said, it's a really key missing puzzle piece at this point to try and smooth a transition of an IT manager going, why should I consider this over something that has the market adoption of Windows 10 and I know I can manage. So I'll be following that and keeping up with your progress. Hey, I guess I think the world that we live in now and the moment, and you mentioned it before, the moment that the Linux desktop has, we're constantly talking about the perennial, year of the Linux desktop. And that seems to always be something that we joke about and something that always seems slightly out of reach. But even from your perspective and definitely from my perspective as well, it's not like we have been around Linux comparatively as long as some of the other members of the community and lead developers and all that kind of thing. But still, I feel like you'd have a tough argument coming up with that we aren't closer than we've ever been to that. Just the sheer amount of adoption of Linux on so many back-end services. I mean, I think I read an article just in the last few weeks saying that that Linux adoption on Azure servers is officially more than Windows or any other operating system that's being deployed in the cloud, and the amount of anecdotal evidence of people making the switch to desktop Linux seems to be on the rise, especially since projects like Proton that Steam has been working on to really smooth the transition with gaming and all of those other things, most of which are featured in some way or other in the project that you guys are working on. There's just so much momentum towards the Linux desktop being a viable thing. Just as our final kind of closing question, is there a missing piece apart from the deployment and management of it in an organizational setting for just the average Joe who uses a computer, maybe at university, to get him through his studies and that kind of thing? Is there any missing gaps in what desktop Linux has to offer as it stands today? And if there is a gap, what would that be?
Yeah, so the situation has been getting a lot better over the past 10 years for Linux. There are still some slight issues with the app gap. There are some apps that some people find very important that still aren't available on Linux, say, for example, Photoshop and the Adobe Suite. There are some really great alternatives to that software, but the fact that people want something that's familiar and works like Photoshop, for example. That is something that does get people a little apprehensive about moving over to Linux.
I swear, if Adobe came out with a Linux version, people would lose their minds. It would be game over.
Yeah, but I think in order to get to that level, which I do think is very achievable, we have to get to a point where Adobe starts noticing Linux and seeing it as an opportunity rather than a cost. Because at the moment they see, Linux having a 2% market share and they're like, I can't be bothered making another version for another operating system. But if we can gradually increase the market share over time, and I do think that moving towards focusing on organizations will get us to that level where Adobe and similar vendors would say, hey, hang on, this is gaining a lot of momentum. We ought to take a focused look at this. I don't think there's a year of the Linux desktop per se, but making that gradual increase in market share is what will get us to that endpoint where it looks like we have a year of the Linux desktop, but it just happens over time.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. Look, it's been a privilege to be able to chat with you and hear your thoughts about the Linux ecosystem in general. I guess this particular show format lends itself to be able to have some longer form conversations about the things that are important to us as Linux developers or just Linux users and enthusiasts. So once again, really appreciate your time, Artyom, and best of luck with the tools and projects that you're currently working on, and we'll be eagerly awaiting the release and I guess some of the more information about that as the year goes on. And I think I've definitely learnt a bunch from this conversation about your project, where it's headed, where it's been, and but I think most importantly your vision for the project is very, very clear. And again, just to kind of dote on you a little bit, I have yet to come across a website for a Linux project that appeals to the average consumer as much as yours does. I've shown it to a few people just for sheer comparison's sake, and they're just like, that's a good looking website. Like, they know how to make themselves look good. So, congratulations on the success that you've had so far. And we hope to see many more moving and shaking from Zorin OS in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. I've been a big fan of the show for many years right now, and it was great to talk to you. So thank you so much.
No problem at all. We'll thanks for tuning in, everyone. We will see you in the next episode. Who knows who we'll be talking to next? But definitely let us know in the comments below when if you have checked out Zorin OS, then let us know what was the first version that you got on board with. And if you haven't yet, then go to zorinos.com and check it out, because even if it's not for you personally, there is probably somebody in your life that could benefit from what the Zorin team are putting out there. Having said all that, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next episode.